what I do is track federal, state, and private money that schools can use to buy products or do research about different topics such as AI. But it's really, I mostly focus on K-12. And this year is really a sea change in some respects, because the Every Student Succeeds Act has replaced No Child Left Behind. So what that means is every state is now has a plan of how they are going to approach all the subject areas, including STEM, including AI, and they have to have a plan. 16 states have already been approved, and the DC, and then the other 34 are in the process of being approved right now. What that means is, the good news is every state has a plan. The bad news is every state has a plan. Okay, so you really, even though there's the same big money, it's 50 different ways of how they're going to implement it. And that's really going to be a challenge for a lot of companies. And even if you're doing research in terms of how states are prioritizing their initiatives. So before Michael starts, I'm just going to give you just a real quick of what the money looks like for this school year. And know that it's going to change next year. Where you see red, that means there's been a decrease. But in terms of funding for AI, whether it's implicit, embedded in the products, or whether it's explicit, Title I always is a big one. Title II, the interesting thing in Washington is there is not an emphasis for professional development. In fact, this administration tried to do away with this completely, even though 45 states have a shortage of STEM teachers. In fact, 45 states have a shortage of teachers, but let's cut out professional development. Doesn't quite make sense. There's a brand new big program called Title IV-A that never existed before. It funds what's called a well-balanced education, 20% of the funds. Another 20 is for social and emotional learning, and 60% is for effective uses of technology, which could fund AI. The problem is, even though it was funded, or it was appropriated at $1.6 billion, Congress only gave $400 million, so a slight decrease. So you can see the rest, even TRIO and Gear Up, which, as Michael Kerr said, preparing kids for college, they wanted to cut it, by $200 million, even though we have those figures that are pretty sad. For those of you who are interested in research money, there was $120 million. You may remember it as the I3 program, Invest in Innovation. Now it's called Education, Innovation, and Research, and it was cut. And I'll show you a quick one. Here's some, they also tried to cut, and Congress put it back in, which is wonderful for arts, again, literacy, teacher quality. So really for 2007, 17, 18 for K-12 is pretty good. Here's what happened in higher ed. So you can look at these as well. Again, pretty flat from last year. So that's the important thing. Even though the Trump administration, the president's budget really tried to cut, as you can see in several areas. So here's the big one for you to be concerned about before Michael starts. This is what's and I've just been back in Washington again in the last couple of months. $9.2 billion for education. It's a pretty big cut. And here are the highlights. So the one that I really want to point out to all of you is that $370 million for education and innovation research. Secretary DeVos has said that probably $250 million will be for research on school choice. So It's just important that we know, what's to come. So that's where I'm just going to leave it, and Michael's going to talk about what the funding is for the companies and what's happening there.
Well, it's interesting that I noticed the $12 billion for special ed. It turns out the first AI application that I knew in education was over 50 years ago. Pat Suppies, who was a philosophy professor here, invented what was called intelligent computer-aided instruction. And the way it went was he'd go to a district and he would sell 8 terminals to a time-sharing system, and it had remedial math and remedial English. And the teacher would take the kids to this computer lab where they would get help learning to read and help learning math. And that was really important because it was special ed. And the districts all bought in because they couldn't spend that special ed money on teachers because there weren't enough teachers who knew how to teach kids to read, dyslexic kids to read, or math-phobic kids math. So these terminals to this time-sharing system did that, and he sold it to a bunch of people, and Pearson, I think, still does some version of it. And there used to be storefronts around here called Score, ! Where they took the same stuff and they put it in an after-school program. So AI in education is not as old as me, but it's at least 50 years old. So I say that because the special ed number jumped out at me and I thought, yeah, that's a place to go. But the people that I work with which are usually mostly foundations, family foundations, Hewlett, MacArthur, Gates, and social impact funds, and also some ed tech focused investors. There was a kind of moment when they got really excited about data, and they funded companies that were all about harvesting the data and turning it around and using it for formative assessment and using it for dashboards for the teachers and for the principals and for the districts and for the states. And it didn't work out very well. So what you would look for if you were talking to these kind of investors and you were reading between the lines, which is a lot more difficult for VCs than it is for foundations, because they want to put their name, on NPR or the San Francisco Opera, is you look for what the problem they want to fund somebody with technology to solve. It's not about the technology much anymore. It's about what's the problem. And one that's really big among the people that I work with now is early learning, K, pre-K, and even before, because it's what I call shorter the better, meaning the earlier that you intervene in a child's life to fix something that's wrong, the more likely you're going to have leverage for that investment. So that's one. Another one is, it's among these social impact funds, but it's not just about that. It's about inequality in education. It's about looking at our population, like Mike said. I mean, over 50% of the students in California are Hispanic. Now, only 1/3 of them are actually English language learners. Most of them were born here, but still, it's a very different population. It's a very different culturally. And for example, our friend Freddie, who's a literacy expert, says we really mess up trying to teach Hispanic kids to learn to read in California because we focus on Anglo-Saxon and German-oriented words in the first 3 years, and then we get the Romance language-based words only in the 4th grade, which in many cases is too late. So it's finding these gaps, these kind of, I don't want to say chronic, but persistent gaps, and trying to equalize things. Does that involve, Head Start was the most famous example of where they really wanted to get kids to get the same kind of, come into school with the same kind of stuff.
And one other thing with what Michael is talking about, a trend, and even written into the regulations this year, is family. So what they really want to see is how you're involving the parents in, just like what Michael's talking about. Not from education, but from agriculture and labor. There is a huge movement to wire rural communities where a lot of different children with different languages are, which means that the tablets, the massive amounts of tablets that have just been sold, are going home. So you have, maybe the child can speak English, but the parents can't. So, you know, and also with these early childhood solutions, how is the family being involved? So that's a big one. I just worked with a portfolio of companies last week, and that's a really big one that they're trying to look at.